Welcome to this training video, which supports the delivery of the Year 7 My Body unit as part of the OAT Citizenship and PSHE Education curriculum. This unit consists of a total of 12 lessons, which are divided into 3 subtopics. The first group of lessons focuses on factors which can affect physical health, including nutrition, sleep, and vaping. There's a lesson on managing personal hygiene, which acts as a bridge to the next subtopic, which focuses on puberty, and that also includes a specific lesson dedicated to menstruation. The final 2 lessons of the unit are a task-based assessment, where pupils are asked to take their knowledge and understanding of what happens during puberty and to create a factual booklet aimed at primary students. Many of these topics are revisited and explored further later on in the secondary curriculum. For example, the lesson on vaping is followed by content in alcohol, prescription drugs, and illicit drugs in years 8, 9, and 10. And content about screen time and sleep also form part of a Year 11 lesson about health and exam performance. Lesson 1 starts with a draw and write baseline task, which can be revisited after subsequent lessons to add further detail. The idea is pretty simple and straightforward. They just have to draw a healthy person. It's important that you don't give any further information about what you're looking for, because the point of the task is to capture people's current understanding of what they think it means to be healthy. It's not meant to be an art lesson, so it's worth letting pupils know that if they want to, they can draw a stick figure, and then they can add to the image, or they can also include labels, which can explain their ideas as well. The reflection activities at the end of each lesson within this first subtopic all direct pupils to go back to this piece of work and to add further ideas to show what they have now learned. By adding these new ideas in a pen of a different colour, you can see the contrast between pupils' initial knowledge and what they've taken in throughout the unit as well. This lesson also includes some content on nutrition, and in theory, pupils should have learnt about healthy eating at primary school. Similar content will also be covered within Key Stage 3 Science and Key Stage 3 Design and Technology. This activity helps pupils to consider the accuracy of the advice they might have been told about different foods and drinks. It's designed so that each pupil receives a question or an answer, which is printed either on a poster or a small card. And then they need to talk to each other to find out who has the matching question or the matching answer. There's also other ways you could run the activity if you wanted to. You could run it like a quiz, where you read the question and pupils try to guess what the answers are, either individually or in pairs. Or you could run it as a card sort task. So the pairs of pupils would have all the questions and all the answers, and they'd have to match them all together. Regardless of which method you choose to use, it's important that you read through all the questions and answers and then unpack what they mean, rather than just moving on to the next task once you've identified the pairs. So for the question shown here, the important takeaway from this is that there's no fixed number of meals that someone should eat in a day. You might then talk about athletes who need to take on energy throughout the day, so they may choose to have 6 smaller meals. Or there might be people who work in jobs with long shifts who have to have 2 large meals and then a small snack in their really brief work break. Many people will have the traditional breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but that's not a hard and fast rule that needs to be followed. Throughout the Citizenship and PSHE Education curriculum, there's threads which underlie the curriculum focusing on influence and decision making. This activity helps pupils to consider who or what has an impact on their decisions about food, exercise, sleep, and other aspects of health. The idea is that pupils will position each of the different demographics onto the dartboard shape. Those with greater influence will be located nearer to the centre, and those with less influence will be positioned further out. You could ask pupils to annotate a few of their responses to show their thinking. Pupils could also add examples of other demographics who they believe have influence or some sway over them as well. It's important that you add relevant local statistics to this slide in the first lesson in advance of delivering the lesson. Overall, it's designed as an introduction of being healthy and that concept. So it's helpful for pupils to be able to recognise key data about health within their local area. There's a lot of data in your local Joint Strategic Needs Assessment, or JSNA, and you can find that online via an online search, or you can use the links on the slide to access the CHIMAT and the local health report data. The signposting slide for lesson 1 also has some blank spaces for you to fill with local organisations who you think it would be beneficial for pupils to know about. The second lesson in the unit is about screen time, and there's an activity early on in the lesson which asks pupils to estimate the amount of time they spend looking at screens in an average 24-hour period. It might be helpful to set a specific time frame, such as whether this is a school day or whether it's over the weekend, so that pupils are supported in their estimates, and then there's a little bit of consistency that you can make measures against. You might also want to consider screens which pupils may not immediately think about, so using computers during their computing lessons, or looking at a sat-nav in a car, or using the order screens at McDonald's. All of those sorts of things are still screen time. You could also set a homework task where pupils keep a diary of the amount of time they spend looking at screens, and then they can compare that back to their initial estimates. Or you could also challenge pupils to not use screens at all for 24 hours, obviously with the exception of any screens that are required for schoolwork or homework, and then you can have pupils report back about their experiences. A task later on in Lesson 2 asks pupils to develop arguments to support an assigned point of view about screen time. So the statement here is students who have more than 6 hours of screen time per day are harming their brain and social development. For this task, you could find and supply some resources for pupils to read and to use as the basis of their arguments, or instead they could come up with their own arguments based on their knowledge and their experiences. So, for example, someone who's been tasked with supporting this argument might suggest that children don't play together outside anymore because they're instead playing online. When pupils have had time to list their ideas, you can then have a formal debate, or you can have a town hall style conversation where different people have the opportunity to share their views. It's good to encourage pupils to build on each other's arguments and to make links where appropriate, or to directly acknowledge a rebuttal back to an earlier speaker. Whilst one pupil is sharing their view, other pupils should be paying attention and adding these arguments to their own worksheet using a pen of a different colour. For example, on this worksheet, the pupil has written down a comment from someone else who mentioned that young people don't need to go outside and play now, as they can develop these interpersonal skills by working with or talking to other people all over the world when playing games online. At the end of the discussion, pupils should then think carefully about the evidence and decide whether they agree or disagree with the statement and explain their reasoning. Lesson 3 builds on the discussion of screen time and focuses on sleep. At the beginning of the lesson, pupils are asked to anonymously write on a post-it note roughly how much sleep they got last night and how much they think they would probably get on an average night. These can be then stuck to a wall or an empty space at the whiteboard, which you can refer to later on in the lesson. The activity shown here is a variation on a true or false style quiz that's reimagined as a game of noughts and crosses. Pupils read each statement and decide whether they think it's true or false. If they think it's true, they draw a circle within the box and they add a comment to be able to explain their reasoning. If they think it's false, they draw a cross and they also add a comment. Ultimately, the pupils are trying to determine whether noughts or crosses is going to win the game. And if they don't have a winner at the end, then at least one of their answers is wrong. When pupils have completed the task, they can talk about their ideas for each statement, and then you can use the answer sheet to explain the correct information. Pupils can then go back to that pen of a different colour, and they can correct any misconceptions they might have had. Later in that same lesson, pupils are asked to use a diamond 9 to decide which of the examples of potential benefits of sleep are of greatest benefit. So in the example here, this pupil has suggested they think the main benefit of feeling is the feeling of having more energy, and the least perceived benefit is supporting the body in recovering and performing in sports. Now, the initial ranking within the Diamond 9 itself isn't so much the focus here, because it's really easy for students to simply write a few keywords in a box without thinking at all, let alone thinking hard about their rankings. So instead, by asking pupils to add some justifications for their top and bottom selections, we're encouraging pupils to really think about the reasons behind their decisions. The justifications don't need to be long, but the benefit of it is that it not only nudges pupils into thinking in greater depth, but it also prepares them for the subsequent discussion when you are seeking to compare those responses. So as discussed in training videos for other units, it's really useful to seek feedback from pupils so that they can get a sense of how other people have also responded. So an easy way to do this is to read each of the 9 responses and to ask pupils to raise their hands if they ranked it in their top 3, which you write in one colour, and then to do it again for the bottom 3, which you then write in a second colour for comparison. This can then open up discussion about the reasons for the placement, and you can focus on examples with a clear difference in response. So in this case, pupils tend to believe that boosting your memory isn't seen as hugely important benefit, so you might want to ask questions about why that's the case. There's also an activity in this lesson which asks pupils to respond to some scenarios about sleep and to provide advice about what the person should do within each of those scenarios. That resource is one that comes from the PSHE Association and requires a membership to PSHE Association to access. If you do have one of those memberships, you can access the resource via the link in the notes of the slide deck for this lesson. Lesson 4 is about vaping, and it starts with the draw and write baseline task, which is similar to the one from the very first lesson of the unit. By asking pupils to draw someone who's smoking, you can have a glimpse into the substances that might be smoked, the various apparatus which might be used to do so, as well as potentially stereotypical ideas about the so-called type of person who might smoke or where they might be smoking. Pupils can then add notes about what else they know about smoking. On the slide, it says to use the second colour, but you could ask pupils to create a line between their drawing and any other answers they can add now. And then at the end of the lesson, pupils can come back and add further information to their drawing and their notes. So you may need to adjust the slide content if you don't have access to a third colour pen, just to differentiate between all of those answers. In the middle of this lesson are a number of charts which are published by ASH, and they show various data sets about young people and vaping. It would be really useful to read the report linked from the slide notes before the lesson so that you can give wider context and explanations when you're asking pupils to unpick this data. So in this chart, we can see a comparison of the reasons why young people have reported using a vape. So the idea of just trying a vape was the most common response given for all young people, regardless of whether or not they'd smoked cigarettes in the past. The popularity of flavours is also an important one to note. So the range of flavours is an argument often cited by critics about how vapes are marketed towards young people, much in the same way that Alcopops have historically been aimed at teenagers. It's also worthwhile discussing the difference between the two groups for specific answers. So why might those who have smoked feel like vapes help them to manage stress, despite non-smokers not feeling the same way? Why might someone use a vape if they don't enjoy the experience as well? In this worksheet, pupils are asked to distinguish between the physical, emotional, and social effects of nicotine. So pupils would choose a colour or a pattern for each of the 3 boxes in the key at the top, and then use those to indicate the relevant type of effect for each of the statements in the main part of the worksheet. After discussing pupils' responses, you can then go through the answers that are on the slide deck, and pupils can check they've got the correct response. It's important for pupils to think really carefully about their answers and not just to jump straight into using their highlighters or felt tips. It might be helpful for pupils to complete this task in pairs, but to ask them to discuss the reasons behind their decisions, and they model those answers in advance of colouring in the worksheet. That way they can also practice what their contributions to the whole class discussion are going to be later. Lesson 5 focuses on dental health, which should have been covered to some degree within primary school. The spider diagram activity at the beginning of the lesson works as another baseline from which you can get a sense of what they've previously learned about. There are some diagrams which you can also use within the slide deck to discuss the role of specific teeth, as well as the structure of a tooth, and you can use the handouts that are provided to be able to help you in your explanations. So this activity shown here is a variation on a quiz, where pupils will move to the different corners of the classroom based on which answer they think is correct. So you will read the statement, and then you'll assign specific answers to each of the corners of the room. And pupils then move to one of those corners based on which one they think is the correct response. It might be helpful to have a small poster or a little sign in each of the corners so that pupils can keep track of which corner is which, or you could just reiterate by gesturing to each corner as you're reading out the options for answers. When pupils have moved to their corners, it's important to ask someone from each corner to explain or justify their views. And this ensures that pupils are thinking about their responses and they're not just following their friends or following the wider crowd. It's also really important that you then recognise pupils who are thinking independently or who have interesting justifications, even if they're not necessarily the ones that you're looking for, but acknowledging the fact that they're standing out from the broader crowd or that they've had a really good logical thought process. You can use the second page of the dental health options file to reveal the correct answers, And that also helps you to provide additional information from the NHS about why that answer is the correct one. You might also want to think about finding neutral positions in which you can stand or perch so that you're not standing particularly close to one of the corners, because pupils may then perceive that you're trying to steer them towards one of those four answers as well. Within this lesson, there's a map that needs to be replaced based on your location. In the slide notes for the lesson, there's a link to a dentist dashboard, which is managed by the House of Commons Library, and that shows dental practices within each parliamentary constituency. If your school catchment area crosses multiple constituencies, it might be worth adding maps of each of the areas so that all pupils know where they can access dental appointments in the local area. The same website also shows local data about the number of adults and children who visited dentists, which can be compared against the national data sets, which would have been discussed earlier in the lesson as well. Lesson 6 is about physical activity, and it begins with this do now task where pupils have 2 or 3 minutes to list a word starting with each letter of the alphabet, which somehow relate to this image. They may, for example, list Olympic events such as archery, badminton, and canoeing, or they might start to identify Olympic host cities such as Atlanta and Barcelona. One way of encouraging all pupils to contribute at the beginning of this lesson is to ask them to each provide an answer for an assigned letter as you're taking the register. So the first person on the register starts with a word starting with A, the next gives an answer starting with B, and so on. If a pupil doesn't have an answer for their assigned letter, you can then ask the wider class for suggestions, and where possible, circle back to those pupils who haven't given an answer further down the list to try and encourage participation and opt in from all of them. Part of this lesson is a discussion of what we mean by the phrase physical activity, and recognising that movements of our day-to-day life can also contribute to our overall physical health. Having talked about the difference between intentional exercise and incidental exercise, pupils are now asked to identify which category each of these activities would fit within. This could be done as a colour coding task, or pupils could be asked to write their answers as 2 lists within their exercise book. When you're talking about recommended guidelines for physical activity, you can create a bespoke graph of locally contextual data using the Sport England website, which is linked from the notes of the slide deck for this lesson. From this graph, you can then discuss with pupils the proportion of people within your region and within your local authority who are and are not meeting that guidance. It's important to also discuss the reasons why people and pupils may or may not be participating in exercise. In particular, drawing their attention to barriers such as the cost of clubs or the cost of equipment, the lack of time due to other responsibilities such as caring, or a need for local facilities to actually be there to be able to use in the first place. This could then extend into a conversation about sporting facilities within your local area, so you could be thinking about how far it is to the nearest velodrome or skate park or ice rink. That discussion then feeds into the final task for the lesson, in which pupils select a scenario from this sheet and offer advice to the character about how they could improve their levels of physical activity. Pupils should ensure that their recommendations are realistic, given the situation described for each character, and that they're trying to give really specific ideas about activities that could be undertaken where possible. Lesson 7 focuses on managing personal hygiene, and it's the bridge lesson to the subtopic which focuses on the changes occurring during puberty. Ideally, it would be helpful to have a bag of various toiletries, such as the ones shown on this slide. As you take each item from the bag, you show the pupils, they could start making notes about what they think each item is or how it's used. And when you've shown all the items, you can distribute the information handouts, and pupils then work in pairs to summarise the details to share with the rest of the class. You could also extend the discussion by demonstrating where or how different items are used. So, for example, you could mimic the process of shaving. You could talk about the benefits or disadvantages of shaving with or against the grain. Alternatively, if you've got access to some water, you could demonstrate the process of using face wash so that pupils know how that should be done. Lesson 8 is the beginning of the puberty subtopic, and this knowledge worksheet acts as a baseline assessment which pupils can add to over subsequent lessons. And that's much in the same way as they did with the drawing of the healthy person at the beginning of this entire unit. There's two activities during this lesson which make use of the Venn diagram handout. The first involves pupils positioning a list of body parts on the Venn diagram based on the sex or sexes to which they belong. When giving instructions for this task, clarify they should only use the top half of the diagram because I'll need to use the bottom half of it a little bit later. So they might want to draw a line across the center horizontally. When pupils have completed the task, you can use some of the images on slides 10, 11, and 12 to show where these anatomical features are located and describe what their functions are. There's two important things to note related to those anatomical drawings. Firstly, it's essential that you are sufficiently prepared to talk about each of the body parts in terms of knowing which parts are which and what they do. And secondly, not all of the items listed on the body part grid for this activity are shown within the drawings just because of the angle of the picture. So for example, the anus isn't shown on the male diagram and the vulva is not defined as a particular region on the female external reproductive diagram. So you would need to be clear in your explanations about which body parts are where. Later in the lesson, pupils are then asked to classify a list of physical changes which occur through puberty on the same worksheet. And that's what you need the space at the bottom of this diagram for. There's a video on slide 19 which pupils could watch to support them in completing this task. And then you've got this blank slide included in the slide deck so that you can model the position of those correct answers. It's important that during this discussion, you clarify that everyone's different and therefore the sequence in which these changes will occur will vary. Equally, the extent to which two boys' shoulders widen or two girls grow taller isn't the same, as they're due to a combination of genetic and environmental factors as well. At the end of this lesson, there's an opportunity for pupils to anonymously ask questions or make a comment. It's important that each pupil in the class writes down something to ensure that the questions that are written are truly anonymous. If pupils don't want to ask a question, they could instead write down their favourite flavour of ice cream, or they could try and tell you a joke. Writing anonymous questions helps to take away a pupil's potential anxiety about asking a question to your face, but then that's not to say that they don't want a personal response. So it can be really helpful to ask them to indicate whether they want a response to the whole class, which maintains confidentiality about who wrote it, a one-to-one response, which would require the pupil to write their name, or whether it's just a comment for your information. After the lesson, you need to have a read through of each of the comments and filter through the questions and the kind of statements from other submissions, and then plan your responses and making sure that they're age and stage appropriate. You also then need to make sure that you've got time in the following lessons to share those answers as appropriate. Lesson 9 builds on that focus of the physical changes throughout puberty and focuses specifically on menstruation. There can often be nervousness and shame talking about periods, but it's important that you're factual and to frame it as just another bodily process. Pupils will often act in accordance with how you are presenting the information. So if you demonstrate that you've got no problem talking about it, then this can just be just another lesson. After watching a video to explain the menstrual cycle, pupils have this worksheet to complete. It's important to stress that 28 days has been chosen as an approximate number, which isn't an exact figure. It's often used because it's 4 weeks and it's a nice cycle, but in practice, an individual's period might vary from 26 days in one cycle to 31 the next, and that change in length of period is often common in younger girls whose periods have just started. Those periods can be quite erratic in terms of cycle length. Having a solid understanding of the menstrual cycle now makes it a lot easier to start talking about contraception and fertility in later year levels. It might be helpful for pupils to watch the video again whilst they're trying to label the diagram. If you want to, they can also colour code the phrases or add small images to help them in strengthening that understanding. The lesson also has an activity where pupils are asked to work in pairs or small groups to summarise information about an item which can be used to manage periods. The lesson is really strengthened by having examples of physical items which you can show and pass around when having that conversation. State-maintained schools have access to free period products through PHS and the Department of Education, and you can request all of the items that are shown here. It's also helpful to simulate the use of these items. So, for example, showing where a pad is positioned on underwear or how a tampon might be put into an applicator and then positioned. You could also make use of the resource from plastic-free periods to talk about the environmental aspect of each of these items if time allows. The final activity in this lesson involves responding to a social media post in a resource from Medway Public Health, which again requires a PSHE Association membership. The idea is that pupils would then select 3 of the comments and give advice to the author of each of those comments about what they could or should do next. The Medway resources also include teacher notes on menstrual products, and that could be quite helpful to refer to during the discussion earlier in the lesson as well. Lesson 10 focuses on managing the emotional changes which may occur during puberty. After discussing the advice about coping during puberty, pupils are asked to give advice to characters and scenarios in a similar way to in the previous lesson. And these scenarios also come from Medway Public Health via the PSHE Association website. This lesson has been deliberately created as a shorter lesson. That's to allow you to factor in time to respond to pupils' anonymous questions or to cover related content which you think is relevant for pupils. It may also be that some of the content from the previous lessons on puberty spills over, and therefore you need some capacity to catch up on that time. The final 2 lessons of the unit have been set aside as time in which pupils will undertake a summative assessment task, in which they will demonstrate their knowledge and understanding through the creation of a booklet which explains puberty to primary age pupils. Pupils are advised of the required elements via this handout and the slide deck for the lesson, and they're given the criteria which will be used in assessing their work. Before they start their work in lesson 11, pupils are shown examples of different informational booklets to help them in identifying examples of good practice and the sorts of things they should be including as well. Pupils can then set to work on creating their booklets, and they can use time in lesson 12 to then complete that task. At the end of lesson 12, pupils then reflect upon their work using the questions on the left side of this assessment feedback form. The questions remain the same on all of the assessment feedback forms throughout the curriculum, and it asks pupils to identify their strengths and their weaknesses within that task, and to also try and find some relevance in why this task might have been set in the first place. You would then collect this feedback form in, along with pupils' work, and give feedback using the rubric and the open space on the right-hand side of the form. You should use the assessment criteria which was listed on the handout and the slide deck to help in determining how proficient pupils have been in demonstrating each of the 5 elements of the assessment framework. In addition, if you've chosen to use the ipsative assessment model, pupils should then give further feedback about their perceived levels of confidence for each of the I can statements. There are many resources which may be helpful in the delivery of this unit, but we're going to focus on 4 specific resources here. First off, the Brook website has a self-paced online learning module about puberty, which may be helpful in improving your subject knowledge prior to covering these lessons. The module is free, although you do need to create a login for the website and then sign in. The other 3 resources listed here are sources of local health data, which can be useful in providing context and making the lessons more relatable for your pupils. Fingertips is a collection of public health data which is overseen by the Department for Health and Social Care. Within the public health profiles section, you can generate localized health profiles which give detailed data at county and district council levels. There are also sections to find data on physical activity, smoking, and dental services, among others. The Office for Health Improvement and Disparities has a website which allows you to view data on maps or to generate reports which compare your local area against national figures. The final resource listed here is youth health data, which is backed by the Association for Young People's Health. This data is more frequently shared as a national level and seems to be accurate as of 2022, but there are a wide range of topics covered, including the use of health services and background living circumstances which may impact upon young people's health. Finally, something that I've not added here because it's very much bespoke to your local area, it's really useful to look at the Joint Strategic Needs Assessment, or JSNA, for your local area. You should be able to find it through a simple online search. This document describes existing and future needs for health, care, and well-being. Data sets are going to differ between the different areas because there's nothing statutory in terms of what needs to be included, but it's based on your local relevance. Equally, some areas are going to have an online data dashboard. Other areas present it as a single PDF document, so you do just need to have a look through it. But it truly is a goldmine of health data, and it often makes comparisons between statistics at national, county, and district levels.